Welcome to this episode of the SoMaTrix podcast. Today's episode is going to be all about how to trust yourself. Over here on the SoMaTrix podcast, we talk about your body, subconscious, and reality. And if you're one of those people who always looks for others' opinions to validate your own opinion, when you're looking constantly outside of yourself for approval, acceptance, decision making, for the yes and no's in your life, this is really for you to examine how much do you really trust yourself? Do you trust your own judgment? Do you look in the mirror every day? Do you look at what you're doing in your life and say, yeah, I can totally make decisions and approve of my own sense of myself? Do you look at what you're doing in life and validate it by yourself? Or are you looking constantly for somebody else to say, hey, good job, you did that and that's awesome, or you could do better and here's why, and you constantly follow those opinions more than you do your own judgment? These might be indications maybe you don't trust yourself as much as you really could. And can you examine the ways that you might be believing things about yourself that are harming that trust, in eroding that trust you have in yourself? Even if in the past you experienced stories or happenings or events where there may have been mistakes, there may have been occurrences that happened where you made the wrong judgment, where you weren't in the right, that does not mean that you can't trust yourself. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't trust yourself. So we're going to look at this today and look at it from two angles, as we always do in the world of Tejal Preman and her guidance through the self-liberation. I always look at the top-down and the bottom-up approach, and what I mean by that is I always look at what is going on in the beliefs of our mind, and also looking then from the beliefs of our mind to what is happening in our physiology. Where is our pain, tension, patterns of actions in the world, behaviors, what is happening from those beliefs? And then I also look at the bottom-up approach, which is what is going on in the physiology of the body. What shapes do we take up? What patterns of holding ourselves, looking at our bodies, what parts of our bodies hold tension, stress, what pressure and activation comes up when we are under stress, listening to certain belief stories. And that is the bottom up. And then from the bottom, the body, we look at what beliefs are manifesting from these places of tension, places of stress and feelings, emotions, etc. So when we look at this, how to trust ourselves, when we look at how to do that better, how to improve upon the relationship that we have with that level of trust, the first thing that I want to look at is the bottom up. And that means when we make a decision, or when we are going out on a limb, or we're starting a new thing, think about something you've started recently that is new in your life, or think about a new relationship, or a new endeavor of anything, or when you made a decision recently. Bring yourself back to that experience. What was happening in your body? Was it in a state of ease and relaxation and just neutrality? And what I mean by neutrality is that you felt present, you felt aware of yourself. There was almost some joy, perhaps contentment with what you were doing? Or were you in a state of freeze or fight or flight, or a state of stress? So did you notice that there was a lot of anxiety happening? Was there a level of tension in your body as you made this decision, as you took this action step, as you embarked on this endeavor? And what that can come to is really, when we look at that, first of all, what type of stress was happening? Was it a freeze? Was it a fight or flight, more of an anxious, activating experience? And second of all, what might be the beliefs that reside behind that feeling? And when we look at this and we really examine it, we will often find that it comes from a pattern of mistrust in ourselves, a fear of some kind, where the body isn't actually saying, hey, I don't trust you. It's saying, hey, there's something that happened in the past where we took this step or we did this thing and it didn't go the way we wanted it to, or we encountered danger or threat or stress and we don't want to experience that again. And we are still in this pattern of thinking that it will happen again. So the way that we tend to this is we repattern somatically the body's response. And we do that actually by going into the response. And this is what I work with one-to-one and group clients with. And the way that we do this is very meticulous, and it involves really tuning into our nervous systems. And I've talked about this in other episodes of the podcast, and this is something that is key to every piece of resolving our body. I kind of see the nervous system like this big tree that exists within us, like branching out to all parts of the body. And if the tree is not functioning, if the tree is stagnant or is in disrepair, then it's like the surrounding leaves and fruit and everything will also be affected, which is like the rest of our body and our mind and our field. So we tend to the nervous system, and we tend where our nervous system has a pattern that needs to be resolved, an event that happened in the past, a story that happened in the past that said, hey, we feel threatened by making a decision out on our own. So maybe you had experiences as well in your childhood or in a past relationship where you trusted in your reality, and then something happened involving other people that caused such a negative event that you started to question whether the way that you were in the world was okay. And therefore, the part of you that needed that safety, that comfort, that love, that didn't get that, now feels untrusting in things working out. And then that remains in us as a piece of a pattern that is unresolved. So let's take it from the top-down approach as well, which is equally as important. This can often be the missing piece for a lot of us, because a lot of us think and act cerebrally, and that's not a bad thing. We have both the capacity to feel and the capacity to think, and both are very important, the capacity to intellectualize and the capacity to intuit. So learning how to dismantle this lack of trust in ourselves from the top down. Well, let us understand that the belief in ourselves as having the capacity to be imperfect. In fact, the fact we are imperfect, the fact that we do make mistakes, the things that we wish to happen don't always happen, the fact that things fall apart, things don't always work out. A lot of us feel that aversion to the idea that things don't always work out, the fact that things fall apart, that we make mistakes, that we're imperfect. This is on the side of the human psyche of the feminine. This is a feminine wound because the feminine reminds us that we're imperfect. If you look at nature, which is very feminine, and the imperfectness of everything in nature. So why do we consider ourselves to be perfect? And we don't recognize that we are a part of nature. Well, we live in a society that separates itself from nature in many ways, and this is at the detriment of many things. And one of those things is recognizing that we are limitless beings that are forever transforming, forever changing, not ever becoming a perfect version of ourselves. That's very far-fetched. If you look at Fibonacci, for example, the ratio that's found everywhere in nature, the phi ratio and the Fibonacci spiral and the Fibonacci geometry, we see that it's always trying to find its way back to zero or find its way back to that 0 point, but it never quite gets there. And that is a very important thing to remember when we look into nature, that no matter how hard we try, we won't ever get to perfect. And that's a belief that if we start to recognize and remember and remind ourselves, then we will start to learn that mistakes and shortcomings and imperfections and the fact that everything fades, falls apart eventually, is a part of our reality. The monks used to have a skull on their desks in the monasteries to remind themselves of the fact that death is a part of life, that it will eventually come for everyone. And the Japanese have the concept of wabi-sabi, which finds the beauty in things evolving, being impermanent, changing, and yugen, which is this belief, or not belief, principle of art that explores this, that everything decays, and that's beautiful. And the reason why it's important to look at this is because then we start to accept, as I said, that we are imperfect, and even the most perfect things in our life will eventually fall apart. So how do you stop that becoming nihilism? Well, that's essentially becoming connected with the light in that, the value in life itself, even though life is finite, even though things are imperfect. People can be imperfect, are imperfect. Situations, scenarios will never be the most perfect, but can we find the beauty in it? Well, actually, that's one of the really mature learnings of life, is to find the beauty in it. And if you're interested in this, I would highly recommend looking into the Japanese philosophy of art, which is something I studied in university and fell in love with the way that they describe these principles. One of them being wabi-sabi, the other being yugen. There's a lot more to it than I've mentioned here on this podcast, but the dark side of the feminine cannot hold that idea of imperfection, and feels that the fact that things fall apart eventually mean that they're not worth it. And we can see that reflected in a society that wants to keep women looking young, looking like maidens, not finding value in the feminine as she ages and becomes wrinkled and wizened, and she isn't this perpetual youth anymore that sustains a level of quote-unquote beauty that older women apparently don't have, but that's not true. But it's this idea of rejecting change, rejecting transformation, rejecting the alchemy that happens as something decays and as something grows, even if it's towards the transformation of death. So really getting in touch with that on an intellectual level can be a way for you to start to accept that mistakes and wrong turns aren't at the cost of who you are, and making these mistakes isn't at the detriment of you as a being, and doesn't destroy who you are. And this is what this sort of shadow feminine or dark feminine feels. And so she cannot find value in living a life that has mistakes or has wrong turns or is imperfect, and therefore can often turn into the chaos itself and adopt a sort of effort. I will do whatever I want and I don't give a crap about the consequences because nothing matters. There's a really great film on this called Everything Everywhere All at Once, and it is fantastic. I highly recommend watching that if these kind of concepts are like resonating really deeply with you. It's a story about a mother and her relationship with her daughter interdimensionally, and all I'll say is that it explores these concepts in a very funny and adventurous way. But yeah, highly recommend that film. So feeling like all is not lost, even though I make mistakes, even though I am imperfect, is really coming to terms with your imperfections, and also finding the value in things as they age, as they fall apart. And you could even take a flower and place it on your table where you go to every day and watch it over time. Watch it decay. Maybe even put it up on a wall and just let it decay and see the process itself and witness it. I think the more that we get in touch with this and the less that we spend away from natural things, boxed up in apartment buildings where we don't have access to the ground, the soil, the earth and everything around it, you know, the more that we break out of that and get back into nature, the more that we'll see that things are constantly changing, and most things have a short life and a short cycle of being here in the way that they are, and they transform into something else, and there's beauty in that and there's value in that. When we come to this concept within ourselves and we can really start to enjoy that process and appreciate it, I actually feel like the level of trust in ourselves increases, because most people are struggling with trusting themselves because they're afraid to make a wrong move. They're afraid that if I do this, X, then I will come to some consequence that I won't be able to undo. And to me, when I look at that, I say, well, hold on a second. Even if that happens, can you still be okay with yourself? And most people will say, well, no, I wouldn't be. And so that's the point that we're getting to, is that an innate part of us recognizes this idea that things fall apart. Even our most dreamlike experiences of life don't last. And I love that my husband always reminds me of this quote that nothing lasts forever, and that's a good thing and also a not so good thing, because when you're in the crap, when you're in the rubbish situations, it's a good thing that it doesn't last forever. But also when you're in the good things, that is bittersweet that it doesn't last forever. But that is an awareness that we can walk through life with. But if we start to reject it, that's when we hold on. That's when we stop trusting, because we're constantly holding on to everything trying to be a certain way, perfect and still and static, and just this how things are right now exactly. But nature isn't that. Life isn't that. Life is a constant evolving, a constant transforming. The one thing that we can always trust in is that everything changes. Robert Frost, it goes on. It's always transforming, and that is a very, very fundamental truth of reality. And for us to reject that, we will find ourselves in situations where we get caught up in illusions, like for women, trying to keep themselves from aging, and relationships that become ever more codependent because neither one wants to evolve together. So it comes up in many different ways. Parents who cannot let go of their children growing and leaving the nest, and so keep them in dysfunctional dynamics. We have many, many examples of where this can show up. So coming to terms with this in our minds, in our meditation, in our everyday, that things change, and that's okay, and there's value in that, because if we never changed, we would never evolve and grow and learn, and there's beauty in that. If the flower stayed exactly how it was, then it would never blossom, and then it would never grow and decay and go back into the earth as nutrients for the soil and feed other parts of life. And so when you accept this, you start to accept that even if you fail, even if you make mistakes, all is not lost. So that's the cerebral side of that. And bringing it back down into the body means that you start to contend with the feelings that your body exhibits when you think about that. When you think about things falling apart, even though right now they're amazing. When you think of the fact that nothing is perfect. When you look at yourself and you realize that you aren't a perfect being, that you are flawed and you will continue to be flawed, no matter how much you go on your quote-unquote healing journey, which is really just a liberation of you recognizing that you are constantly evolving as a limitless being that will go on forever and ever. So when you start to do this, feelings will come up, and inevitably nervous system events might come up where you feel unsafe, because all of a sudden you're bringing up this idea that your sense of security and safety can't be built on static things outside of yourself, because there is nothing static outside of yourself. So when you've been relying on a relationship or a home or an environment or a situation to keep you stable, then coming to terms with the idea that those things will eventually evolve, will eventually become something different, even if that is when you you leave this life. When you do that, you have to turn inwards and look at, well, what can I lean on and rely on at all? And you can lean on the truth of yourself through everything, and the truth of love, and the truth of the entire cosmos being there for you. A sense of safety itself from source, from within, from the perpetual energy that keeps you going as a consciousness throughout existence. The eternal self is known in many, many spiritual doctrines, religions, spiritual ideas and ideologies. And that is really important. And you can get to that very pragmatically or practically through understanding your nervous system, which is attuned to and try and get back to a sense of connection with itself. And actually that can bring you all the safety you need. And when you have that, then the body feels, okay, well, even if all of these things around me change and evolve and transform and fall apart and fall together as something else, and reveal themselves to be something that they're not, or eventually become something different, I will be okay. But remember that we don't necessarily get there by just saying that to ourselves. We have to get there with the body. And this is the somatic side of this experience. The body, the bottom side of this experience. The nervous system side. Because we might have had, as I said, events in the past that caused us a lot of wounding and pain, and really it's where the nervous system has not resolved events that it needed to survive, that it doesn't feel like it is safe. And it doesn't feel like it's safe because, say you were in a fight that you didn't have the capacity or the time to witness what your nervous system needed, or say you were in a perpetually dysfunctional household or environment, or say you were in a work environment that was constantly stressful and you were never seen or heard in that environment, or you were in a relationship where you were always put down, and whatever it was, the story doesn't really matter. Actually, it's the state that your nervous system remained in and continued to experience the world through the state of survival of, okay, well, we've recognized, the body has recognized that we needed to be on guard, we needed to brace, we needed to hide in order to protect ourselves. And that threat doesn't seem to have gone away because we never had the time to hold and process and be with that experience. So we're going to remain in this state of vigilance and wariness. And therefore the world feels like a threat, and the world doesn't feel trustworthy. Therefore you don't feel trustworthy. And therefore here we are at this place where we are recognizing that we are walking around with a lack of trust and afraid that if we aren't a level of perfect, if we aren't a level of staticness and steadiness and holding on to things as they are right now, then the next moment could be danger and threat again. So that's a little dive into that topic. This has been a very intently packed episode of information, but if you're interested in diving deeper into this, there's always my ebooks to start you off on understanding your nervous system and learning about these methodologies that help you tend to the past experiences of your nervous system, so that this trust can be forged within yourself, so that you can learn to embody and express yourself as this imperfect, completely authentic self. So I will leave this episode right there for you. Thank you for tuning in once again, and I will see you on the next episode.